Today I'm going to be creating another seascape painting using a combination of finger paint and heavy texture. I've created several small 5x7 seascapes using just finger painting, and I really like those. I actually teach a class doing that, and people find it to be a lot of fun. They're real stress busters. And I also like using the heavy texture though, and you can get either textured molding paste at art stores, or I have found that I really like this Permanent Patch 101 by Shur Stik. I get that at Home Depot, and I have experimented with adding in Liquitex acrylic ink, and I've also added acrylic paints to it, and both of those work very well. I have another video where I show how to create a very heavily textured cat using the Permanent Patch 101 and acrylic paints. In that video I laid down the texture first, and then I went back and painted over it. In my last video I created heavily textured tulips, and in that painting I actually mixed the acrylic ink directly with the permanent patch, and that worked really well. And I also mixed acrylic paints with the permanent patch for other areas of the painting, and that also worked well. So for this painting I'm going to use both of those techniques as well as finger painting, and I may end up using a little bit of brush in there as well. So the first thing I'll do is create my background, which will be all unbleached titanium, or another name for that would be Titan Buff. I like to do that because it gives it kind of a little bit more of a rustic look. If I put that down first, it seals the canvas nicely, but also I let the Titan Buff come in a little bit around the front area, and then I just leave the edges a little bit rough when I start the actual area of the painting. I put down my first coat of paint, and I really don't need any other coats of paint as far as the unbleached titanium goes, because I'm going to be putting a lot of texture and other paints when I do my finger painting. So this just basically gets the sides and kind of a nice undercoat. Now if I had some white areas along the sides here, I would have touched that up, because I want that effect of the sides showing a little bit of the buff, and so I'll probably come back and take that out. Then one of the nice things about landscapes is you don't have to be perfect any place. There are no absolute lines and things like that, except when it comes to water. You do need to have the horizontal line absolutely straight. You can have a little bit of variation within the line, because that can be atmospheric effects. It can also be a little bit of waves or something like that, but you don't want the line tilting this way or that way. Rocks and everything else, you can pretty much do whatever you want. So I'm going to start with the sky. I always like to start with the sky. That sort of sets the mood for my painting. And this is going to be a stormy day. I'm basing this off of a smaller painting that I did. My smaller painting is vertical. It's a small 5x7, whereas this one is a square, but I can still make it work. I brought the rock in a little bit further, and so this gives me a lot of really nice space to work with. So it's just, the whole thing is maybe slightly closer to me. And I brought the rock this way a bit because I want the overall composition to be such that this is sort of the left third of the painting pretty much. Here it's maybe over slightly more. But this base is around a third. And so I think that this composition will work. Now as I go I may change it a bit, but you can see how stormy this background is. There's a little bit of blue showing through. I want that same kind of a look on this one, but we'll see how it goes, because I never really know for sure. So what I do is I lay down my paint first. And I'm using various colors, and I'll list them below. For my sky, I have Payne's Gray, Prussian Blue, Cerulean Blue. This brings in a little bit of the brighter blue. White, I always use white. I have some actual black in here too, which I can mix with the white, and that will create the grayer sky. So I'll just lay this down a couple of different places here. Kind of gets me started. Like I've said in other videos where I do finger painting, it's probably a good idea to wear gloves. I don't wear gloves when I work with this, and I am not using paints that have metals in them, like such as the cadmium yellow and some of those. So I think I'm fine. I just prefer not to use gloves. I've tried it and it doesn't work for me. And at this point, I'm not adding texture to the sky. I think I'll get what I want with just the finger painting. So we'll see what kind of effects I get here. The white has a lot of nice body to it. And it's not a heavy body paint that I'm using today, but it does have some nice body. And see, up at the edges here, I'm not really too concerned with it going and making an absolute line here. I don't really want that. I want it to be just kind of fuzzed out at the edges. And I'm coming down a little over that rock because that rock will be painted in later. And I can go back and add texture with the white if I want to bring in a real heavy cloud. At this point, I'm just dipping my finger back in the paint. And I'm not really too concerned here about what exact color I get. It's all mixed up at this point, which is nice. And as I come down towards the horizon here, I'm letting it kind of become grayer and less distinct of clouds. Because as you come down towards the horizon, you want it to look like you're fading way back. In this painting down here, it's just very dark. You can imagine this is quite a storm coming. And there's a bit of blue sky up here, but there's, even though this is fairly abstract, impressionist, I guess you would call it, there's still this feeling of depth to the painting, and you can see that these are clouds, and there's more definition up here, so that tells you these clouds are closer to you. The further you look towards the horizon, the further those clouds are away from you, so you want less definition and distinction with those. So down here, I really don't have much as far as definition. It just sort of fades away. And then, okay, now I'll let that dry. And I'll start adding the watercolors. And the water now can have, as I come forward, I would like to have that have a lot of texture, and this rock will have a lot of texture, and there'll be the waterfall coming down the rock. So at this point, I'm going to get out my permanent patch. Prussian blue is a real nice color too. For a stormy area of an ocean, green can add a feeling of storminess. A greenish blue looks more Caribbean, but in this case, this makes it look more shallow. But back in here where it's a darker green, that can almost look like deeper areas. So you can play around with greens and white mixes. And then by throwing in some of the Titan Buff here, unbleached titanium. I also use warm gray for sand colors. That's a real pretty color. But that kind of makes it look like it's just really hitting the sand and churning up a lot, and there's even some sand in it. So I'm going to go for that kind of an effect too. So I think that I can just kind of take my spatula and throw that out. Ooh, that's pretty. So this, at this point, can be kind of a mix between a spatula painting. Maybe even grab a little bit of green here. I just kind of play around with colors and see what I get. It's quite pretty. It can be stormy, but still be a pretty painting. And I'll come back with a brush and run right along there, because the horizon line a lot of times is amplified a little. It's just slightly darker, and it's good. It's good for the eye to see that that's definitely a horizon line, and I kind of have to, for me, I have to bring the brush in to do that. Throw in a little bit pretty blue there. Now I'm going to take some Prussian blue again. Prussian blue and pain gray. Pain gray is almost black, but not quite. I use this Payne's Gray by Grumbacher. I love that color. Let's see, I don't want actual black, so let's kind of throw some of that out. Make sure I have enough gray, Payne Gray. Prussian blue is just like a slightly brighter shade than Payne's Gray. And I like how this just sort of fades out and gets a little bit rough at the sides here. It's like little tiny dots there of paint where it didn't quite totally sink in, and I like that effect. It's a nice way for it to just sort of run off at the edge, instead of, like I said, you don't want a perfect edge to it. And when you're working with finger paints, it's really a good idea to, I mean, if you're going to be doing finger painting, it's a really good idea to have a wet cloth next to you so you can dip your fingers as you go along. And see, the palette gets a certain effect, and then fingers get a different effect than the palette. You can sort of spread it around a little easier. But I like the effect of the palette as well, so I really like doing both, and I love this texture. By the overall composition, your eye will take in the whole scene, and the brain will interpret for you what is going on there. So coming this way, I'm going to start adding more green. And I also am grabbing some of this texture. I call it texture. That's what I'm using for texture. It's the permanent patch. I'm grabbing some of that along with the green. And then I can just get that really swirly kind of thing going on there. Throw in various colors. This is just very stormy. This is where the ocean is coming this way, and there will be a waterfall coming down here, and then it just all hits. And this water here is mostly from the waterfall, but there's also some water coming in from the ocean that hits it. And so at this point, you just kind of play around until you get what you want. Now I may let that dry, because as I'm bringing a lot of colors together, it's starting to get a little bit muddy looking, and I don't want to lose my colors. Sometimes with the certain amount of mixing, you get too much mixing going on, then you kind of, you get what people call a muddy look, where it's hard to distinguish one color from another. This warm gray is just a slightly warmer version than the Titan Buff. Titan Buff, it's like it has a little bit of a gold tone to it, a little more yellow thrown in. They both work well, it just depends on what you're looking for. And I think they go well together as well, because I have warm gray in here that sets this area off different from the background, but it still blends nicely. So I may throw down a little bit of texture here just to kind of get something interesting going. And I often throw in other colors. Having blue in the sand can be pretty, and it kind of balances out the whole thing. Now I'll grab my warm gray, start painting in my sand. And sand often has little areas that are darker as well. And I have a little bit of line left over here from earlier. I want to make sure that doesn't show. I'll take a clean finger, grab some Titan Buff there, and just go over this. I don't necessarily want texture there, so I'll have to make sure I take that out really well. I can just run that into the side a little bit there. And then I'll come back and add some foamy stuff. Then I just have my cliff and waterfall and maybe a few trees up here in my smaller painting. I had just a hint of a few trees. My sky doesn't come over real far, so we'll see on that what happens. So at this point I'm going to start laying down some texture and color for my cliff. So I'll take my texture here, and again I have some blue in it and things, and that's alright. I don't know what I'll do with it yet. Like with all of my paintings, I get started, and I had a more definite idea with this one because I've already made some small ones. But even so, I don't know for sure what I'm going to be doing until I actually start to do it. That cliff goes back behind the water. And I do want a good edge here on my cliff. So I'll kind of probably let this dry a little bit. Okay, so I'm going to let that be. And for this one I laid down the texture first, and I'll go back and paint it rather than mixing the paints with the texture, which I could have done that as well. But I kind of like the texture that I have, so I believe that I will just let that sit now. So I'll let that dry, then I'll come back and paint. Okay, this is now dried for actually a few hours because I had an errand to run. I'm sure it would have been dry in about 15 minutes or so, enough to work with. And so I'm going to start adding some color here to my rock. Another thing that I will be doing is some of this blue sky actually kind of got laid down over the gray sky. You probably don't see it real well in the video, but it's important with a textured painting like this that the outer textures be on top of what is behind it. The blue sky, of course, is not lying over the clouds. The clouds are in front of the blue sky. So I'm going to go back and add a bit more there to make it very clear that this is the edge of clouds. I think that'll add a lot to the painting too. Then I'll clean up this line a little bit along here. And this can be a little fuzzy, but the problem with it right now is there's a little bit of canvas showing through, this buff colored canvas. Then I have a little bit of a line here to clean up. But right now I'm going to show you, in case you didn't see my previous tulip video, I just like to show you this ink. I'll put a little bit of yellow in the rock. This is acrylic ink, and I can mix that right with my Shur Stik Permanent Patch. Actually can mix right together with it. I'm going to adjust the camera a little bit though so that you can see my palette better. So this is my permanent patch, and I just took a little bit of that acrylic ink and mixed right into it. There's a few other colors here too, but I just wanted to show you how nice that mixes together. And then I can put some of that down. It gives it a little bit of color in the texture. And I'm only doing this because I mentioned in the beginning of the painting that I would use a little bit of acrylic ink as well, and I didn't actually end up doing that. I will use some of that again. I'm real curious what that blue looks like. It's probably really quite pretty, and I can mix that with the texture and put a little bit more palette work across here and build this up a little bit. So for right now though, I will use my brush. Come in and do a little bit of brush work on my rock. And this is a pretty crisp edge out here because this is the edge of the rock. Side of it. I like to use different colors. I just dip my brush in, this is black, and then I dip it again in the brown, and then I end up with different colors automatically. It's like it does the shading for me. I don't even have to really worry about it. And this yellow is actually showing through a little bit. And it adds a little color. Now if you lay down the color with the texture, it's just a completely different feeling to it than laying the texture first and then painting over it. I like both ways. It just really kind of depends. Sometimes, like with the tulips, I felt like I wanted to mix it all up ahead of time because that was sort of a new technique I was trying. With the textured cat, I did all my texture work first and then I painted over it. So you can try it different ways and see what you're more comfortable with. And I think when I'm all finished, I'll do a little finger paint along the edge here because it's a little bit of a sharp edge. And I like how this kind of fades out the way that palette knife work would do. I think I'll use the pain gray because I want this to be kind of dark. This is going to be a dark cloud now that I'm bringing in. Can make it definitely an edge to the cloud there. So I'm mixing that in with my directly with the texture, the paste that I'm using for texture. So remember, when I say I'm adding it to the texture, what I really mean is I'm adding it to a permanent patch. So even that is definitely above but the clouds are definitely in front of the sky now instead of almost looking the other way. It gives it more of a 3D kind of an appearance here. I like that. Clouds are usually darker on the underside than on the top side though, so I may go back and add just a bit more detail for that. I don't want my white caps there to be too white. They can show up a bit, but they don't need to be quite so white. The further away you are, the less you're going to really pick up the little white caps too. They get closer and closer together as they near the horizon. And this is my favorite little Frazzly brush that I feature in a lot of my videos. It's just so perfect for adding foam edges. That's the fun thing about adding all this texture, is you go back later and your eye will pick up things that you hadn't even really thought of at the time you were putting it in. Another color that I really like is alizarin crimson. It's not a bright red. It's more like a very dark berry. Doesn't take much, but just a tiny touch of that scattered in a little bit just brings in a little bit of color to the painting that wouldn't be there otherwise. Like I said, it doesn't take too much, so I'll come back and go over that a little. I'd have to wait till that dries. I don't want the eye to go right there and really pick up a red spot, but I think it's just kind of pretty though. Now I'm just picking up a little bit of blue, dark Payne's gray, and the white. Go over it if it's not quite enough. If it's not quite enough color, or I don't notice it quite as much, I can go back and add a little bit more of the white. And then up in here, I want really a lot of frothy stuff going on. Now the waterfall will sort of set the mood for what else I want to do. And that's still quite wet. So I'm going to let the whole thing dry, and then I'll work on this a bit more. I can already tell I'm not quite happy with that. I need to change that up a bit. Okay, now I'm going to be finishing up my painting, I believe. And I have actually worked on this a little bit. Before I started the camera, I just put a little more paint on there and ran my finger back and forth, just kind of blend that in a little bit better. So I think that part is okay now. So now it's just a matter of my waterfall, maybe a little bit of greenery up here, and then it'll be finished. So at this point I have a real nice Liquitex Heavy Body White paint. I don't want to just use the texture because that's not really paint. It wouldn't really have the right finish. It's meant to be painted. And I can even put a little bit of the blue, other colors in. And this is just sort of running down the rocks in different areas. could even try doing a little finger painting down through that to kind of get a little bit heavier water going there. And I'm just adding little hints of greenery up here. Not real noticeable. The eye might just barely notice it up there. Every time you layer, you get a new look. So these are, as the waves come down through this way, they hit up against the rock, and some of them will come up fairly high. There'll be sprays. Thank you for watching.